It was early October when the small town of Arbaville began preparing for Halloween. The local tradition involved more than just pumpkins and candy. Each house was required to have a scarecrow in the yard. They said it was a way to ward off wandering spirits that roamed the town at this time of year. As new residents, we didn't want to stand out from the neighborhood. So we put together an improvised scarecrow with old clothes and a faded hat. The result wasn't very impressive, but it served its purpose. It looked like any other scarecrow, a bit clumsy, with its head made from an irregular pumpkin. At first, everything seemed normal. The nights were quiet, and the scarecrow stood there motionless in the corner of the yard. However, by the second week of October, something strange started to happen. On the first morning, when I went out to get the newspaper, I noticed the scarecrow was turned toward the house, with its head slightly tilted, as if it were watching us. I thought it was the wind and adjusted it back to its original position, assuming it was just a coincidence. But the next day, it had moved again. This time, it was a few steps closer to the porch. The discomfort began to grow. I mentioned it to my wife, Clara, but she laughed and said it was probably teenagers playing pranks. I decided to secure the scarecrow, tying it firmly to the post, and went back inside, certain the problem was solved. The next morning, I woke to Clara calling me from the porch, her voice trembling. I rushed to see what was happening, and I felt my blood run cold. The scarecrow was now standing next to the front door, its arms raised as if it were about to knock. The hat that had previously been loose on its head was now perfectly adjusted, and the carved expression on the pumpkin seemed different. The crooked smile looked more sinister, more alive. That night was the first time we locked all the windows and doors, although deep down, we knew this wasn't just a prank. Something was wrong. Clara suggested we burn the scarecrow, but something inside me resisted the idea, as if a part of my mind was convinced that it would only make things worse. Deep down, I knew the scarecrow wasn't an ordinary object. It seemed conscious. When I woke in the middle of the night, I felt an intense cold in the house, as if winter had arrived suddenly. I went down to the living room to check, and there it was, the scarecrow standing inside the house. It didn't make sense. All the doors were locked and the windows closed. And yet, there it was, with its arms stretched out to the sides, as if it wanted to embrace us. I felt a mix of fear and fascination. I couldn't move for a few seconds, as if I were hypnotized by its presence. I ran back to the bedroom and woke Clara, explaining what had happened. We decided to burn the scarecrow the next morning, but as a precaution, we locked it in the garage for the rest of the night. I put padlocks on the door and piled furniture in front of it. I knew none of that would make a difference, but I had to try something. Morning came, and I hadn't slept a wink. We went down to the garage, ready to get rid of it once and for all. But when we opened the door, we found the garage completely empty. The scarecrow was gone. We looked around, desperate, and then we saw it. It was back in the yard, standing in the exact same spot as before, as if nothing had happened. The pumpkin head wore an even wider, more mocking grin. That was when we realized it wasn't just a cursed decoration. There was something much more sinister behind the scarecrow's presence. It didn't want to be destroyed. It wanted to stay, and it was getting closer little by little every night. The following nights were a nightmare. Each morning, the scarecrow was closer, first on the porch, then at the front door. On the third day, we found it in the kitchen. And finally, on the last night of October, it was standing beside our bed. I could feel its cold breath as we slept, a frigid, damp wind that seemed to come from the mouth of the pumpkin. There was no escape. It had found us, and there was no way to stop it. The next morning, the neighbors knocked on our door, concerned because they hadn't seen us on Halloween. When they entered, they found only 2 new figures in the yard. 2 scarecrows, dressed in old clothes and faded hats. Each of them wore a grotesque expression of eternal despair. And there they stood, motionless and silent, waiting for the next family who dared to decorate them on Halloween night. Enjoying the suspense? Go ahead and hit subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Comment below with what you think will happen next. That morning, I hadn't planned on buying anything. The Halloween fair in the city center was just a casual stroll, something to enjoy the festive atmosphere and see the decorations. But then I saw the mask. It was hanging at a small stall in the farthest corner of the fair, almost hidden among common trinkets. There was something about it that immediately caught my attention. It was simple, made of dark brown leather, with 2 perfect holes for the eyes and no other markings. A mask without expression, without identity. Something in its simplicity drew me in almost hypnotically. I asked the vendor how much it cost. He gave me a strange look, as if he knew something I didn't, and replied, "It's already found you. The price doesn't matter." I didn't pay much attention to the comment. I thought it was just part of the sales pitch. I quickly paid and took the mask home, unaware that I had just opened the door to something that should never have been awakened. That night, I stood in front of the bedroom mirror, admiring the piece. Something about it felt right, as if it had been made for me. I put it on my face, and the moment the mask touched my skin, I felt a slight chill. The world around me darkened for a second, and then I saw something unexpected. Behind the eye holes of the mask, I didn't see the reflection of my room. I saw another place, a dark, misty environment, as if I were looking into the depths of an ancient, abandoned cave. I thought it was just a trick of my mind. I quickly took off the mask, my heart racing. I put it back on a few minutes later, this time more prepared for what I would see. The vision from the other side repeated itself. It wasn't my home, nor my reflection in the mirror. It was a vast, empty space, with shadows moving slowly, as if something alive were lurking. And then, for the first time, I saw a figure. It was distant, a vaguely human silhouette, but something about it filled me with instinctive fear. The figure was motionless, but I knew it was watching me. Each night, my curiosity grew. I kept putting on the mask, trying to learn more about that strange world. The figure I saw came closer each time I looked. At first, it was in the background, almost invisible in the mist. But as the days passed, it moved closer. Now I could make out more details. Pale, almost translucent skin, and black eyes that seemed like bottomless pits. There was something both fascinating and terrifying about that presence. It was as if it were waiting for me, drawing me into that space. But each time I took off the mask, a strange sensation overtook me, as if part of me had stayed behind. I started having trouble distinguishing the real from the imagined. Sometimes, during the day, I would still see flashes from the other side, even without the mask. It was as if the 2 realities were merging. The night before Halloween, curiosity triumphed over fear. I put on the mask again, but this time the figure was too close. It was only inches away from me, and I could see its face in detail. It was my own face. Not just similar, it was a perfect copy, but with dead, expressionless eyes. Before I could react, I felt a cold hand touch my shoulder from the other side of the mask, and everything went dark. When I regained consciousness, I was standing in the middle of the room, still wearing the mask. But something was wrong. The reflection in the mirror showed the figure I had seen. A version of me, but empty, as if my soul had been replaced. I desperately took off the mask, but the feeling of emptiness remained. It was as if something had crossed over to my side. On Halloween night, I started to realize I wasn't alone. The air in the house felt heavier, and the shadows on the walls moved on their own. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw that version of myself, smiling in a way I never would. Things got worse when the mask began appearing in unexpected places. I would lock it in a drawer, but I'd find it on the kitchen table, on the living room sofa, and even beside my bed. I decided to get rid of it. The next morning, I took the mask to a dumpster in the city center and threw it away. I returned home, relieved, thinking it was all over. But when I opened the bedroom door that night, there it was, waiting for me on the pillow. This time, there was something different. A note pinned to it, with a single word handwritten on it. Welcome. From that moment on, I knew there was no escape. The mask wasn't just a cursed object. It was a passage, a connection between two worlds, and I had crossed the line. Now, the presence from the other side was growing stronger. I could feel it around me, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. And I knew that soon, it would take over completely. On the last night of Halloween, something changed. The mask was no longer where I had left it. Instead, I found it in the mirror, floating in the air, as if waiting for me. I didn't resist. I knew I had no choice. I put it on one last time and felt my body being pulled into the mirror, as if reality had dissolved around me. Now I'm on the other side. I am the figure in the mist, patiently waiting for the next person who dares to wear the mask. And when that happens, I'll be ready to cross over again, to take their place in the real world, while they remain trapped here in eternal darkness. I found the clock at a flea market on the outskirts of town. It was in a dusty corner, almost hidden among old and broken objects. It was large, made of dark wood and metal, with thin hands that seemed not to have moved for a long time. Despite its state of neglect, something about the clock drew me in. Maybe it was the intricate design around the dial or the feeling that it carried a long, forgotten history. I paid a symbolic amount for it and took it home. I decided to hang it in the living room, thinking it would add an interesting vintage touch to the space. As soon as I placed it on the wall, I felt a chill run down my spine, as if the air around me had shifted slightly. I wound the clock, and it immediately began to work, marking time with a firm and hypnotic ticking. The hands moved slowly, as if they were waking up from a deep sleep. The first few nights were peaceful. The sound of the clock filled the house in a comforting way, almost like silent company. But then, on the night before Halloween, it started behaving strangely. At 3 o'clock in the morning, I heard the clock chime. There was no reason for it to happen. It didn't have an alarm mechanism. The melody was soft, but there was something unsettling about it, as if each chime carried a sense of weight, of something imminent. The first time it happened, I ignored it, thinking it was just a defect. But the next night, the clock chimed again, exactly at 3 o'clock. Only this time, it wasn't just the sound that changed. When I opened my eyes, I felt that the atmosphere in the house was different. The shadows on the walls seemed denser, and there was a sensation that I wasn't alone. For a moment, I thought I heard soft footsteps, as if someone were walking barefoot through the living room. I got up, turned on the lights, and went to check. The clock was stopped at the same time, 3 o'clock sharp. The hands no longer moved, but the ticking continued, echoing through the house like a heartbeat out of sync. And then I saw something that left me frozen. The reflection in the clock's glass wasn't that of the living room. It was another place. It looked like an old room, with dark wooden furniture and an iron bed. In the center of the room, there was a figure sitting with its back to me. It didn't move, but I could feel it was aware of my presence. I tried to pull the clock from the wall, but it seemed stuck, as if it had fused with the plaster. With each attempt, I felt an even more intense chill, as if an invisible energy was preventing me from touching it. I went back to bed, trying to convince myself that it was all just a dream, but the clock's chime kept ringing in my mind, even after I covered my ears with the pillow. On Halloween night, I woke up again at 3 in the morning, as if my body knew something was about to happen. The clock chimed once more, but this time, instead of the soft melody, I heard whispers coming from inside the clock's dial. Low voices, murmuring words I couldn't understand. The figure in the reflection was now facing me, with a pale face and eyes that glowed in the darkness. That's when I realized the clock wasn't just an old object. It was a passage, a connection between two worlds. And now, something from the other side wanted to cross over. The chimes grew louder, and the entire house seemed to shake under their weight. I ran to the living room, desperate to rip the clock off the wall, but it wouldn't budge. The voices intensified, forming a cacophony that seemed to surround me, as if they were trying to pull me into the dial. Suddenly, the second hand began to spin frantically, turning backward, as if time were being reversed. The walls around me started to distort, and the living room slowly transformed into the room I had seen in the reflection. The figure was now in front of me, and before I could react, it reached out its hand toward me. The touch was cold and empty, and I felt my vision darken, as if I were being sucked into an abyss. When I woke up, I was alone in the house, but something had changed. The clock was intact, stopped exactly at 3 o'clock, but now there was a mark on the glass of the dial, the impression of a hand from the inside. Since that night, it has never worked again. The ticking has fallen silent, but the feeling that something is still here remains. Sometimes, in the silence of the early hours, I think I hear whispers coming from the wall, as if the figure is still trying to cross over. And now, every time I look at the clock, I'm sure I see my own reflection smiling back at me, a smile that isn't mine.